Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the screening of episode 5 from documentary series PV Change with Continuity. We express our sincere gratitude to the Honorable Chief Minister K. Chandrasekhar Rao Garu, Shri PV Narasimha Rao Centenary Celebrations Committee, and Telangana Sahitya Academy for making this event possible. Today, our guest is Dr. Sanjaya Baru. Dr. Baru is a leading public intellectual, thinker, and author. He is popularly known for his book Accidental Prime Minister, which is a memoir about his time as media advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Baru Garu also authored a very interesting book called 1991 How PV Narasimha Rao Made History, in which he focuses on how Narasimha Rao became Prime Minister in 1991 and transformed India on various fronts. Dr. Baru and his father, Sri Baru Panduranga Vitthal, had close personal association with PV Narasimha Rao Garu. We interviewed Baru Garu in Delhi in 2018 January when he was Secretary General of FICCI. He's the only person who appears in almost all episodes of this documentary series. In the episode we are going to watch now, which is on Narasimha Rao's foreign policy, Dr. Baru is the most important interviewee. Sir, thank you for kindly accepting our invitation and joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me with you here.
First, we'll watch a part of the 5th episode from the series, and then we'll have a conversation with Baru Garu. Post your reflections on the episode and your questions to Baru Garu in the chat below.
The earlier generation of Indian diplomats, those who grew under Nehru's influence, they realized that India was not a rich country, India was not a major industrial economy, India was not in a position to use money to earn friends. So they chose to use, quote unquote, kind of India's culture as a weapon to project India's image. And also build this whole non-aligned movement and show the world that the Africans are with us, the Southeast Asians are with us, the Latin Americans are with us, the Arabs are with us, this whole trade union approach, that I have the numbers. I may not have the money, but I have the numbers, right? So that was the way in which I call the non-aligned movement a trade union movement. The rich man is a capitalist and you want to negotiate with him, you need a union. Alone, you can't negotiate, right? So non-aligned movement was a trade union movement and we were trade union leaders.
What foreign policy did the non-aligned movement have? None. Apart from your national security, what you're talking about, unity and integrity of the country, what is the primary aim of foreign policy? To improve the well-being of your people.
Indian diplomacy was all about giving grand speeches and making big statements about India's destiny, civilization, culture, all this big stuff. While the real business of diplomacy was about money, market access, investments, that was what the rest of the world was looking at.
We were looking at ourselves as a more or less autonomous economy, which could not be globalized. We were scared of globalization. We were scared about admitting foreign investment. And we were scared about how trade would affect our economy. And perhaps for these reasons, it affected our relationship with the world because the world did not take us that seriously.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
In the year 1989, the Soviet Union accounted for 17% of our trade. And by 1992, this went down to 2%. So here was a country that was an important defense partner, strategic partner, trading partner. And then suddenly it disappears.
In the world, the Soviet Union had collapsed. Germany was being united. USA was becoming the sole superpower.
Well, Indian diplomacy was blind to the change. In fact, the kind of dispatches that our ambassador and other diplomats were sending to Delhi gave the impression to the political leadership that, this is one more of those things that happens in the Communist Party, and the Communist Party will come back. By the end of 91, by December 91, when it became clear that things were rapidly changing, Narasimha Rao started talking to the better informed diplomats. For example, Ronan Sen, who was a joint secretary in Rajiv Gandhi's PM.
With the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a completely different situation, and he realized that. He didn't believe in slogans, he believed in how it should happen, because he was not fond of rhetorical flourishes or event management. No. But in terms of building those institutions.
He stepped back a little he did not join any anti-Western world, etc. rhetoric. He slowly distanced himself from the old non-aligned formulation.
And he laid down the ground rules for that plan. So I think it was a very important part of Indian history that such a thing happened, that he went out and did it and told the world that we are now open. India is open to do business. We are not the older India.
India is open for business. We are interested in partnership, in forging long-term relationships with our foreign partners for the benefit of both sides.
It was a new period in India. No one could think that an Indian Prime Minister would be going out asking foreign investors for money, because we were so steeped in self-reliance, so steeped in our license Raj, so steeped in the way that only Indian manufacturers could do things. For someone to be so radically changing a program, an economic program, was the big surprise.
The fact that the reform process took off, it made our international relations far easier, which were complicated before that. For instance, in the case of China, his very visit to China was very significant.
There's this famous Mao Zedong phrase, walking on two legs. So I think in a sense, Narasimha Rao said to the Chinese, let's walk on two legs. One leg is economic, one leg is bilateral relationship. And was able to separate the economic relationship from the border and political relationship.
He also had this major thrust towards the ASEAN countries, the Association of Southeastern Nations. Now, this was again something where he talked of the look east.
Lee Kuan Yew, who was the founder president of Singapore, approached India for a partnership. India was invited to be a founding member of ASEAN when ASEAN was launched. And we said, no, all these small countries, they're a big country. Singapore was a small city, like Bombay, it's not a country.
We had neglected the East, even in Pandit Nehru's time. He hardly took any interest in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia. Not much.
So we had a very condescending attitude. We thought, we were far too important, and this part of the world was like dealing with the small Indian states. What we did not understand is the kind of rapid progress they were making. And I think finally Narasimha Rao was the first Prime Minister who reached out. And the Singapore Prime Minister at that time was Goh Chok Tong. And Goh Chok Tong has written and has spoken about it many times that Narasimha Rao's visit to Singapore, I think in early 92, created an India fever. This was the phrase used by Goh Chok Tong. Created an India fever. And once there was an India fever in Singapore, because it's the most developed of the ASEAN countries, everybody in the region woke up. Suddenly everybody said, why is Singapore paying so much attention to India? So Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Laos, Cambodia, all of the region woke up to India.
Then he sort of made a dramatic shift by upgrading his relations with Israel.
A major decision to take. In 1992, he said, we'll send We'll open an embassy and they will open an embassy here.
When PV discovered that the Cold War had ended and we must build relationship with the United States, he thought that the best way to forge a relationship with the United States is to forge a relationship with Israel, given the enormous influence Israel had in the United States. Israel, the Jewish lobby in American politics is extremely influential.
We should have had open relations with Iran much earlier. Because it may be a small country, but it's a very influential country.
And Narasimha Rao understood that if I build a bridge with Israel, then I build a stronger relationship with the United States.
Let's face facts. The US relationship involves the political, the military, defense, and the economic and commercial. And of course, much else, trade and so on. But the first thing he did was give them the political confidence that we are not looking for allies to balance our relationship with the US, because the Soviet Union had just collapsed. His visit in 1994, which was my first visit, and I joined just before that, was momentous. In fact, we got a very good declaration out of the US. He established a level of confidence with President Clinton, which was, I would say, almost unprecedented till then. And so this confidence is what resulted in the turnaround.
And if you see the support for India in the US Senate on various legislations, it increased every year during Narasimha Rao's term. So there was clearly a recognition that India was becoming more open to investment, more open to trade. And so the business leadership in the US became softer and softer towards India.
Clinton, who was very hostile to him to begin with, by the time he ended, had become quite friendly.
A lot of academic debate.
So what do you think about this bit?
Very well done. Very interesting people you have got there. Ronan Sen, Natwar Singh, Shekhar. Very interesting.
Sir, I have a question. Exactly what safety net did Narasimha Rao lay for Indians when he opened up the economy? For instance, while Lee Kuan Yew championed free trade, he established housing and economic development boards, which did a great job at providing housing and employment in Singapore. Also, Lee Kuan Yew combined sound financial and economic policy with a strong corruption control framework. Did Narasimha Rao miss these lessons from Lee Kuan Yew?
No, I think the first and the most important safety net that Narasimha Rao ensured was that there would be no increase in unemployment as a consequence of liberalization. When he met the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Michel Camdessou, and Camdessou gave him a long lecture on all the benefits for India from trade liberalization, from delicensing, decontrol, how the economy would improve, etc., etc. Narasimha Rao said only one thing. He said, look, I'm willing to do whatever all you people think should do, provided not one person loses his job as a consequence of what I'm doing. That was his only condition, that I will not accept unemployment as a consequence of my economic initiatives. And I think that was a very, very powerful political statement coming from him. I mean, particularly today, when we are living through a sharp increase in unemployment, and we do not hear the political leadership today make that kind of a commitment, prevent companies from firing people. I mean, so many people are losing jobs. I wrote an article recently in a magazine called The Week, which they refused to publish because I said journalists are losing jobs. In the media, hundreds of journalists have lost jobs in the last 1 year, right? And they refused to publish that article, so I stopped writing for them. But the point is that unemployment was always the consequence of privatization and liberalization, because companies shed excess labor in the pursuit of competitiveness. I think Narasimha Rao ensured that that was the safety net. He has been criticized for one thing or other, his government. And in fact, I was one of the critics. I wrote a paper in 1991, I remember, in the Economic and Political Weekly, though I was a journalist working for Economic Times, but I did write a paper in Economic and Political Weekly, drawing attention to the sharp reduction in the spending on health and education. And that was about the time that, Amartya Sen's writings had come out on the importance of investment in education and health, etc. So drawing from many of those arguments, we said that the whole structural adjustment and the fiscal adjustment program was neglecting health and education. Manmohan Singh was a finance minister, and initially he got very angry with me for writing that. For 6 months, he refused to see me. But soon the government realized that the criticism was fair. And, expenditure, particularly on education, started going up. Because again, education was an important concern for Narasimha Rao, who was himself a minister for education. That period did not see any major social crisis. In fact, the left tried to mobilize. I remember there was a huge rally in the Boat Club lawns in Delhi from India Gate till Raisina Hill. There was a sea of red flags. One of the biggest working class movement rallies in the national capital. But the economy started picking up, jobs started increasing. So as the economy improved, I think people also realized that what Narasimha Rao was trying to do was not that harmful to them.
So, but do you think people really understood what he was doing in those years? This whole thing.
No, they didn't understand. That is precisely why making sure that nobody loses a job was important for him. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, each one of us understands the consequence of macroeconomic policies based on our own experience. If there's inflation, prices are going up, petrol prices are going up, diesel price going up, vegetable prices going up, I lose a job or my children don't get jobs. When negative things impact me as an individual, then I understand the consequence of economic policy. But if things are going all right and my life is moving on as normally, how do I make a difference when the fiscal deficit is 5.9% of GDP or fiscal deficit is 7.5% of GDP or the external trade deficit is so many X billion dollars or Y billion dollars? People don't understand those things, right? In fact, even on the whole criticism of going to the IMF, I don't know if I shared this earlier with you when you recorded that interview 4 years ago. There's a lovely story from Prime Minister Rao. I once interviewed him for the Economic Times. And that was a time when, the left was criticizing him, saying that, you're going to the International Monetary Fund, which is controlled by the Americans, and the United States will dictate things to you, etc. So, Narasimha Rao is making India basically supplicate in front of the United States. So I asked Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, I said, sir, what is your response to this? So he said, look, all this criticism is all you urban fellows, you people like you make this criticism. I come from a village, and in the village, every peasant is indebted to the landlord. If you go to the peasant and say that the landlord is evil, the landlord is twisting your arms, the landlord is making you work on his farm without paying you, landlord is exploiting your family, the peasant will say, yes, he is powerful, I'm weak. Now, on whose side would popular sympathy be? On the side of the peasant or on the side of the landlord? So I said, yes, you got a point. So he said, I'm the peasant, I'm borrowing from the IMF and the United States landlords. People's sympathy will be with me, not against me. There's a poor fellow is trying to save the country and look, his arms are being twisted. So he had that earthy political, sense of policy. He knew how to, provide political leadership. And I think that is the essence of Narasimha Rao's contribution in 1991, 92, 93, which is that while Manmohan Singh, Montague Ahluwalia, Rakesh Mohan, and all these economists were doing trade policy, economic policy, fiscal policy, he provided the political leadership to that change.
But did he deliberately, one of the points that we make in this documentary is that he deliberately did not communicate what he was doing. It was kind of a choice. And as a former media advisor to former Prime Minister, do you think he completely failed in terms of managing media during his tenure?
No, in fact, he completely succeeded by not communicating and allowing people like Manmohan Singh and Montague to communicate, because he understood Delhi media. You know what Narendra Modi now calls Lutyens media, this elite, Delhi elite. He knew that people like Montague Ahluwalia, Manmohan Singh, they're all Delhi walas, St. Stephen's, Delhi University, these guys know the editors of Economic Times and Financial Express and Times of India, let the Delhiwalas deal with the Delhiwalas. He dealt with Atal Bihari Vajpayee. He dealt with opposition political leaders. He made sure that though his was a minority government, it did not fall. And that's the important thing, that he provided the political backing. And he ensured that the opposition was with him, though opposition on the streets were against him. The left were against him, the BJP was against him. But in parliament, where it matters, he did not get voted out. There was no confidence motion against Narasimha Rao. And the BJP support lasted till 1992 when the Babri Masjid thing happened. That is when he parted company with the BJP. But till then, Vajpayee was very close to him. So he ensured political backing while leaving the Delhiwalas to do all the media management, and one take was very popular. I remember, I think I can share this story now. My father passed away a year back. My father telling me once that he said to Narasimha Rao, look, people say that you're surrounded by all these, foreign educated advisors. It's a common criticism. Even Narendra Modi faced that when he had Raghuram Rajan and Arvind Subramaniam, a lot of BJP fellows, foreign educated advisors. And in fact, many of them left the country. But when my father said this to Narasimha Rao, he said, yes, they are foreign educated, but these guys know how to talk to Washington and London. And I know this, I need these chaps because I need them to communicate with the rest of the world. So a very wise political leader.
I mean, so I haven't seen him giving a political speech in a public rally. And I mean, now we have Narendra Modi and we have very charismatic leaders. And how was it before, like during Narasimha Rao's times, how did people receive him as a prime minister, as a person who's heading the state? I remember reading your this is Baru's book. And we have in the appendix, we have a whole speech of Narasimha Rao Garu, which Baru his father helped him write. So, but the speech is very boring. I mean, he delivered it. I watched the whole speech, the video recorded speech. We have put some in the documentary film also. It was very boring. He was just reading English speech. And so how did he communicate directly with the people?
He did not. He did not communicate. He did not have to. And he left that to others in the party. There were many more, rooted grassroots level politicians of Sharad Pawar in Maharashtra, Arjun Singh in Madhya Pradesh, Tiwari and others in Uttar Pradesh. So party had regional leaders. In fact, that was one of the strengths of the Congress party, that it had very powerful regional leaders who had been eclipsed during the reign of Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, and many of them into their own at the state level. So he allowed state level leaders to do whatever be done at the state level. He was not a particularly charismatic, he was certainly not a charismatic leader, but he was also not a very effective communicator. And I think you're absolutely right. He was a very boring kind of public speaker. But frankly, I don't believe elections are won or lost on the basis of public speech. I mean, if that was the case, then BJP should have won in Bengal last month, a couple of months. My God, what kind of fantastic speeches we heard from Amit Shah and Narendra Modi, who are much better speakers than Mamata Banerjee. But speeches don't win you elections. It's your grassroots power, your party's grassroots power. That is what wins elections. And Congress at that time still had a little bit of that. That was a period when the BJP started eating into the Congress base, particularly in the north, in Bihar and UP. So the party was under decline.
So you talked about Narasimha Rao being a villager. I mean, he embraced village. And in many of his speeches that I've seen, he kept talking about improving lifestyles of the villagers, improving the traditional lifestyles and embracing the modernity from the West. So how did he balance these two aspects of his own life? He was bringing modernity from the West, but at the same time he was advocating villages should not go away and villages should become. He was essentially a Gandhian in that sense. So how
Well, that is not unique to Narasimha Rao. That is unique to that generation. You look at all the national leaders that came out of the national movement. In fact, I forget now who makes the point that with the singular exception of people like Jawaharlal Nehru or V.K. Krishnamenon, who were essentially urban and westernized, a large number of the leadership that came out of the national movement, first of all, they were bilingual. They were as proficient in their mother tongue as they were in the English language. Whether it's Tagore or Rajagopalachari or Narasimha Rao or any of those people, you can at random pick up names of Indian political leadership in that period. Because they were still students during British rule, they had learnt English. But in almost all their education, the mother tongue was being taught. And therefore, they were bilingual. Of course, Narasimha Rao was multilingual. He knew several languages, but he was certainly bilingual. But bilingual not only in terms of the language spoken, but bilingual in a cultural sense. That you are as comfortable sitting in your village home, on the floor, in your dhoti, eating food on a plantain leaf, as you would be sitting in a banquet in the Queen Elizabeth's palace in London, eating with fork and spoon. And that generation do that. Even Mahatma Gandhi could do that. He was also comfortable in his dhoti, in his lungi, as he was dealing with the West. He had studied lived abroad, etc. So that is something that is typical of that entire generation. And in fact, one of the points I make in my new book, The Power Elite, is that this is going away. I mean, this ability to deal with both tradition and modernity, which was one of the strengths of the Indian elite in the past, is slowly going away with the new elite no longer willing to, be familiar with the rest of the world and going back into their roots.
Sir, we have questions from audience. Pavan Timmavajula is asking, was Narasimha Rao a more pragmatic and realist prime minister vis-a-vis China policy than Modi?
Well, certainly Narasimha Rao was a pragmatic foreign policy maker. In fact, I think that was foreign policy was one of his strengths because he was a foreign minister during Indira Gandhi's time. And I'm pretty sure he would have learnt a lot from Mrs. Gandhi herself, who was also a very deft foreign policy leader for India. After all, she succeeded in breaking up Pakistan and creating Bangladesh. And she knew how to deal with the rest of the world. And I think Narasimha Rao certainly learnt a lot during the period. After all, before he became foreign minister, he was chief minister of Andhra Pradesh. He was general secretary of the party. He was not someone who was exposed to the rest of the world. But I remember when I was a student at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in 1974-76, in those 2 years, when Narasimha Rao was the general secretary of the Congress party living in Delhi, I would find Narasimha Rao on JNU campus every other week. He used to come to the homes of professors on JNU campus, Professor Rashiduddin Khan, Professor Bimal Prasad, various professors in the School of International Studies. Narasimha Rao would drive in his Fiat car, come to JNU campus and would be seen. And we used to see him on the campus because I knew, being from Hyderabad, I knew who he was. But he was this elderly gentleman in his dhoti walking around campus with professors of the university. So I'm pretty sure he spent a lot of time understanding foreign policy, understanding international affairs. And he was a successful foreign minister. And therefore, when he became prime minister, he knew exactly how to deal with the world. And he was certainly pragmatic when it came to China. I think many of the initiatives that Rajiv Gandhi first started were taken forward by Narasimha Rao with China. I think the problem with Narendra Modi and the BJP is that there is a peculiar mix of pragmatism and ideology. And we see that in almost everything they do. If you stick to pragmatism, you can be far more successful in politics. If ideology is only a cover. But sometimes ideology holds them back or makes them do silly things, and then you get into trouble. So I think it's that balance we have to strike between ideology and pragmatism, and Narasimha Rao struck a good balance.
So Kashyap is asking, what is your opinion on the political changes and foreign policy changes that are not studied enough like economic changes?
Well, I think that's no longer true. I think there's a lot of research now on the post-Cold War period in the 1990s. Several books have been written both by academics as well as very senior journalists, which look at changes in Indian foreign policy, particularly after the end of the Cold War after 1991. So I think there is now what is lacking, and that is where I have tried to bridge these two worlds. What is lacking is an understanding of foreign policy which is based on an understanding of economic policy, and an understanding of economic policy based on an understanding of foreign policy. The problem, if you look at a lot of the economic analysis of 1991, what Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh did, almost all the economists who were writing at that period, and some of the top economists, I don't want to get into names, their whole interpretation was that this was an economic solution to an economic crisis. In my judgment, and I've written about this, 1991 was not just an economic solution to an economic crisis. It was both a political solution and a foreign policy solution. India changed its relationship with the United States. India changed its relationship with East Asia, with Japan, with Korea, with ASEAN, with China. India changed its relationship with the European Union because all these relationships were seen from the point of view of economic policy, of the need for us to find new markets, of the need to bring in new investment, of the need to access new technology. So that link that exists between economic policy and foreign policy, that is, most of my writing has been in this area. But it is true that foreign policy, international relations scholars are essentially political scientists. Their entire analysis on the geopolitics and the politics of international relations. The economists are macroeconomics, microeconomics, look at trade policy, and the two live in different worlds. And I don't think there's adequate appreciation of the link between the two. And 1991 offers a good moment in history when, in fact, both were very closely interrelated.
Sir, when it comes to reforms, lots of people interviewed him. You also interviewed him after 96, Narasimha Rao, especially, a lot of interviews that I read, that I also met other journalists who met him. They felt that he was not happy with the way the reforms happened, especially post 96, and he was also expressing a kind of regret that we are being culturally colonized by the West. I have it on record in one of the episodes where he says that we are forgetting our languages, we are forgetting some of our traditions, we are losing them in the onslaught of modernity that happened post reforms. He said that. So, did you have such conversations, and what do you think about that?
Well, no, I did not have any such conversations, but it's certainly the kind of thing that you would expect someone like Narasimha Rao to be reflecting upon. And former prime ministers have a lot of time to reflect. I'm sure he was spending a lot of that time reflecting on these issues. But the fact is that his concerns were legitimate, because for a lot of the Indian middle class, liberalization was about accessing imported products. Oh, you can now get Coca-Cola, you can now buy foreign brands, you can now travel more easily, foreign exchange conversion is easy, we had travelers checks, we had credit cards. So liberalization was really about globalization. But liberalization is also about unleashing domestic potential, the potential of entrepreneurship. And the interesting thing about most of our middle class is that we are not as rooted culturally as, for example, we find in East Asia. After all, Japan is one of the most modern countries in the world. Korea is one of the most modern countries in the world. And yet they're culturally very rooted in Japanese culture, in Korean culture, in Chinese culture. So that integrated relationship between being globalized intellectually, mentally, accepting new ideas, seeing the world for what it is, but at the same time being rooted in your own culture. That was not obviously there in India as much. And from what you say, I guess someone like Mr. Narasimha Rao would have worried about this. I think a lot of people would worry, even today, that we don't pay adequate attention to a proper understanding of our own culture, while we are all quite ready to spend money, traveling around the world and accessing entertainment from around the world.
And during the process, especially during the 90s when these reforms were being discussed and when these were being implemented, the whole discourse about environment or ecology or sustainability, that was completely absent, especially during the initial years. And do you think that is one of the failures of the reform process that happened during this tenure?
No, I wouldn't call it a failure, because it's not a failure because it is not a objective. If that was your objective and you didn't achieve it, that would have been a failure. But the objective was to really push economic growth, to unleash entrepreneurial talents. I keep mentioning these three numbers to students all the time. India grew at 3% per annum from 1950 to 1980, at 5.5% per annum from 1980 to 2000, and at 7.5% from 2000 to 2015. This acceleration of growth, 3.5, 5.5, 7.5, that was the objective of policy, particularly in the 90s, because in the 80s we saw the economy beginning to take off. Till the 80s, India was a poor third world country with the largest number of poor people in the world. Nobody took India seriously. India was not seen as a potential market. In fact, if you look at studies of India and China going back even to the 1970s, the Western analysts are all saying China is a potential market, not India, because they're not in enough purchasing power. It was a poorer country. But as the economic growth picked up, everything began to change for us. So the objective of policy in that period when Narasimha Rao was Prime Minister from 91 to 96 was not sustainable development, was not climate change, was not development. These are all objectives that came up later, particularly after the turn of the century. The objective then was increase employment, increase incomes, reduce poverty. And that is a process that began in the 90s and went on till around 2010, I would say.
But based on his speeches, I got to know that he was not, he was not advocate of the kind of modernization, the rapid urbanization that Manmohan Singh and the current regime is advocating. He wanted villages to remain, villages to function. At the same time, he wanted to allow liberalization, in a controlled way. Not like he didn't want to open up the doors wide open. So, what do you think about that?
Well, I don't know. I've not in those speeches where he has said this, but the fact as a person, he was global. He learned foreign languages. He learned computer language. He was traveling around the world. He had seen the world. So he was in my judgment, a person who understood the need of the hour. In many ways, he was like came from the past, rooted in the past, very traditional, but at the same time aware of the future, aware of the needs of the future. And therefore, he allowed a lot of things to happen. He may not have been comfortable. There are two different things. When you're the Prime Minister of a country, you allow a lot of things to happen with which you may not personally be comfortable. But you understand that this is what the country needs. And I'm not as familiar with his thinking in that period on these issues, so I can't speak for him. But I can certainly say this, that I don't see a contradiction between someone being very, very traditional and at the same time being very, very modern. And I keep going back to the example of the independence generation, Rabindranath Tagore, Swami Vivekananda. When you read his speeches, he understood the importance of industrialization. He understood the importance of teaching science to Indian students. They were all modernizers, but at the same time, They were deeply religious, rooted in Indian culture, rooted in Indian language. And I think that's the kind of personality Narasimha Rao was, and he didn't see a contradiction between the two. I think the fallacy today is we see it as a contradiction. Bharat versus India, being Indian versus being, non-Indian. No, I think he saw a continuum in our personality that we are this and that. And I think you refer to the AICC speech, the Tirupati session speech, which I have reprinted here. He quotes the Buddha extensively and talks of the middle path. And there's a lovely phrase, when he speaks of the middle path, when he says the middle path is not a rejection of other paths. I can't exactly get the quote now. I'll have to search for it. But he says in this, the middle path is not a rejection of other paths. It is an independent path. It's a separate path. So it's not your left, right, dono ko milao, take a average, and the middle path is a little bit of left, little bit of right. No. Third path, which in a sense fulfills your aspirations and your needs.
In fact, you name one of your chapters as the middle way.
That's right. That's right. The middle way. Yeah.
So Strong.
We have one more question from Kashyap. He's asking how it would have been if Narasimha Rao got another term as Prime Minister.
Well, that's actually a fascinating question. And, these are all the what ifs of history, which one can speculate endlessly. I think first thing, if he had got a second term as Prime Minister, the BJP would not be in power today. I think the rise of the BJP that was facilitated by the leadership of Prime Minister Vajpayee. And I have enormous regard for Prime Minister Vajpayee. But that may not have happened. He would have gone away. Vajpayee would have simply retired. And one doesn't know in what way BJP would have evolved. But the other thing that would have happened is that the Gandhi family may not have been around, because the Congress party would then have gone back to Congress persons. The problem is that in 1969, after the split, the Congress became identified with the Nehru-Gandhi family. In fact, it was called the Indira Congress. Even routinely in the media, everybody referred to the Congress after 69 as the Indira Congress. Which is why in all my writings, including in this book, I refer to the today's Congress as the Sonia Congress. It's not it's old Congress party. So what Narasimha Rao tried to do was to take the Congress back to its origins, back to being the Indian National Congress, which is what it was. Till 1969, it was the Indian National Congress. So it's possible that would have happened. And one can speculate. After all, what ifs can go on and on. One can speculate other changes.
Sir, in your recent book, you talk about, elite, India's power elite. So it's the Lutyens' Delhi and the kind of Congress system that existed. And do you think the leadership that that Congress has right now has continuously failed? It failed in 2014, 2019, but somehow the leadership, Narasimha Rao became the head of that leadership during that 91 to 96. And do you think that can happen? In future, maybe that should happen. Something like that should happen in future. And a kind of because Narasimha Rao was essentially a Congress intellectual. There are a few Congress intellectuals left, but they are of course very corrupted. But do you think there is a decline in kind of public intellectuals who are also politicians in the public space right now?
Well, the point I make in my new book on the power elite is that the politics of the country has drifted in the direction of bringing in the economically better off sections, the wealthy, and I call India now a plutocracy. It is a government of the rich, by the rich, for the rich. And you cannot really be in politics of enormous amount of funds. Either you should have it yourself, like a lot of individual political leaders, or your party should have it. And money power has become important. from municipal election to state elections to Zilla Parishad election to parliament elections. Everywhere money power has become important. And given that, I think intellectuals tend to shy away from politics unless they are nominated or they are able to come from the few constituencies in the country where people still have some regard for intellectuals. So other than that, most of our politicians are now businessmen. In fact, what I show in my book is that either you have politicians who use political power to become businessmen, or you have businessmen who use money power to become politicians. And if you look at the composition of MLAs and MPs across the country, majority of them, in one business or the other. Either they're running schools, colleges, universities, hospitals, or they're running businesses, airlines, proxy, all of this stuff. So I think the era when you could get someone like a Narasimha Rao into politics, coming up the ladder, an intellectual who devoted his time to reading, writing, learning, and then finally becomes Prime Minister of the country, or even a Manmohan Singh, or even a Vajpayee. They were all intellectuals. Vajpayee was a great poet. Manmohan Singh was a great economist. Now, is it possible for such people to come up the political ladder? Becoming increasingly difficult.
On that note, we'll end the session. Thank you so much, sir, for coming and talking and sharing your views. We thoroughly enjoyed interviewing you in 2018 and also editing your speech, editing your interview, and reading your books. I would definitely read your new book, and I would recommend all the viewers to read this book. I've watched some of the interviews of yours on this new book. And tomorrow we'll have Dr. Ramchandra Murthy Garu. Tomorrow we'll be playing the episode on Babri, and day after we'll have Shekhar Gupta Garu, where we'll be dealing with elections of '96 and a nuclear policy of Narasimha Rao. So we'll be doing it till June 28th. Stay tuned, and all the episodes are uploaded on the channel. And thank you so much for attending this conversation.
Thank you.
See you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
For taking the time to have this conversation with us.
Thank you, Srikar.